Title: He spent 30 years in solitary. What he revealed after release will shock you. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The story begins. The cell that swallowed a man. The story of Albert Woodfox begins in the Deep South, in a time when America's prisons were already bursting with injustice. In 1971, Albert was a young black man from New Orleans, caught in the cycle that trapped many in poverty and petty crime. Arrested for armed robbery, he was sentenced to the Louisiana State Penitentiary, known to the world as Angola, a place infamous for its brutality. Once a slave plantation, it had become one of the harshest maximum security prisons in the United States. The land carried the weight of its past. Rows of fields still worked by prisoners under the Louisiana sun, overseen by armed guards on horseback. When Albert arrived, he was just 20-something, wiry, restless, intelligent. But what awaited him was not redemption, it was despair. Angola in the 1970s was a place ruled by violence. Racial segregation ran deep. Prison gangs controlled entire cell blocks, and guards often turned a blind eye. It wasn't reform, it was survival. In 1972, something would change his life forever. A young prison guard named Brent Miller was found murdered. In the chaos that followed, the administration wanted answers, and they wanted them fast. Albert, already known for his activism and association with the Black Panther Party, was accused along with two others, Herman Wallace and Robert King. Together, they became known as the Angola Three. The evidence was shaky, the witnesses unreliable, but in that moment, truth mattered less than control. Within months, Albert was convicted of Miller's murder and sentenced to life in solitary confinement. His new home was a 6 by 9 foot cell, barely large enough to stretch both arms. The walls were gray, stained with time. A small slit of a window let in only a sliver of daylight. For 23 hours a day, Albert was locked inside. 1 hour of freedom meant pacing a small fenced yard, alone under the gaze of guards who watched from towers. His meals were slid through a narrow metal slot. Human contact was reduced to the sound of boots in the hallway, the clang of steel doors, and the muffled cries of other men locked in their own boxes. At first, Albert believed it would last a few weeks, maybe months, until the truth came out. But the weeks turned into years and the years into decades. Each day blurred into the next. To survive, he built a world within his mind. He read books, studied law, meditated, exercised in silence. He spoke to ants crawling across the concrete floor, the only living things that didn't look away. He refused to let the prison break him. "I may be locked in a cage," he once said, "but my mind is still free." That thought became his lifeline. But isolation plays tricks on the human mind. Nights grew long and endless. Sometimes he would wake up unsure if he was still alive. The air was thick and unmoving. There were no mirrors, no laughter, no human warmth. Only time, crushing, endless time. He learned to measure it by the sound of guards changing shifts or the rare call of an inmate being transferred down the hall. Outside, the world changed. Presidents came and went, wars began and ended, technology transformed society. Yet inside, Albert remained frozen in a time that refused to move. His body began to fail him. Arthritis from years of concrete floors, his eyesight fading from the dim light, and the slow, quiet ache of a soul too long untouched. But through it all, Albert never stopped fighting. He wrote letters, thousands of them, to journalists, lawyers, and human rights groups. His voice, though trapped behind walls, began to echo beyond them. And somewhere out there, people started to listen. The fight for freedom. Years passed, and Albert Woodfox's life became measured not in seasons, but in walls, cold, gray, unchanging. Yet, beyond those walls, a quiet storm was forming. The letters he'd written began to reach the right people. Journalists, lawyers, and human rights advocates who saw his story for what it truly was, not a case of justice served, but a man buried alive by a system that refused to admit its mistakes. Among those who heard his voice were members of Amnesty International and a small circle of civil rights lawyers. They began digging into the details of his conviction. The evidence that had condemned him was crumbling under scrutiny. Witnesses who testified against him were proven unreliable. Some had been bribed or coerced. Fingerprints, DNA, and physical evidence connecting Albert to the guard's death were non-existent. Yet the Louisiana prison system refused to let him go. He was labeled a threat, not for what he'd done, but for what he represented, defiance. Inside his cell, Albert built routines that would keep his mind from disintegrating. Each morning he'd drop to the floor and do hundreds of push-ups, then squats, then laps in place until sweat covered his face. He taught himself meditation, reciting mantras to silence the noise in his head. He read everything he could: philosophy, politics, poetry. Books were my escape, he said later. Every page reminded me that I was still human. His letters from solitary became weapons of truth. In one he wrote, "If a man can't stand for what's right, then what does his life mean?" Those words resonated far beyond Angola's walls. Journalists began to tell his story. Documentaries started to form. Across the world, people began to question how a nation that called itself free could keep a man isolated for decades. Still, the prison fought back. Wardens changed, but the system remained the same. Albert's appeals were denied again and again. They called him dangerous, radical, a threat to prison order. In truth, he was just a man with a mind too strong to break. Outside, others from the Angola Three, Robert King and Herman Wallace, continued the same struggle. King had been released in 2001 after 29 years in solitary, his conviction overturned. Wallace's freedom came in 2013, when his own case was thrown out due to constitutional violations. But he was already dying from liver cancer. He passed away just 3 days after being released, tasting freedom only at the edge of death. Albert received the news in his cell. The grief was heavy but sharpened his resolve. If his brothers had fought to their last breath, he would not stop now. "They can bury our bodies," he wrote, "but not the truth." By the mid-2000s, his case had become international. Amnesty International launched a campaign demanding his release, labeling his decades in solitary a form of torture. The world's press began covering it: The New York Times, The Guardian, BBC, and countless others. His name became a symbol, not just for wrongful imprisonment but for resilience in the face of state power. Then, slowly, cracks appeared in the wall of silence. Federal courts started to question Louisiana's justification for keeping him isolated. Psychologists testified about the devastating effects of decades of solitary confinement. Former prison officials admitted under oath that the Angola Three had been targeted because of their political beliefs, not their actions. Albert's lawyers filed appeal after appeal. Every rejection hit like a hammer, but he never stopped writing, never stopped believing that someone someday would listen. By 2014, he had spent over 40 years in that small cell. His health was deteriorating: heart problems, swollen joints, fading memory, but his determination only grew stronger. Then a turning point came. In 2015, a federal judge overturned his conviction, citing racial bias, constitutional violations, and lack of credible evidence. But Louisiana's Attorney General appealed the decision, delaying his release yet again. It was as if the system itself could not bear to admit it had caged an innocent man for most of his life. The pressure, however, was mounting. Journalists continued to expose the truth. Protesters marched in front of courthouses carrying signs that read, "Free Albert Woodfox." International human rights groups called his case one of the most blatant examples of prolonged human rights abuse in modern America. And then, finally, after more than 4 decades, the impossible happened. On February 19, 2016, Albert Woodfox walked out of the Louisiana State Penitentiary a free man. It was his 69th birthday. After 43 years, the door that had closed behind him finally opened. Reporters waited outside as he stepped into the sunlight, squinting, trembling, overwhelmed. The first thing he did was hug his family. The second thing he did was smile. When asked how he felt, Albert simply said, "I'm free. I never thought I'd see this day, but I never stopped believing it could come." The man who refused to break. The sunlight that hit Albert Woodfox's face on February 19, 2016, was unlike any light he had seen in 43 years. It was warm, blinding, and real. Reporters gathered outside Angola prison as the gates swung open. Cameras flashed, microphones stretched forward, and voices called his name. But Albert stood still for a moment, breathing. The air smelled different. The sky looked endless. For the first time in decades, there was no steel door between him and the world. He stepped forward slowly, almost uncertain of the ground beneath his feet. "Freedom," he whispered, "is a strange thing when you've been buried alive." His niece hugged him, his lawyers stood beside him, and the crowd applauded. Yet inside, Albert carried something no one could see: the weight of 4 decades in a box. In the days that followed, the world wanted to hear his story. Television crews, human rights organizations, and universities invited him to speak. He was soft-spoken, humble, and deliberate in his words. "I don't have hate in my heart," he told the press. "Hate only poisons the vessel that carries it. What I want is justice, not just for me but for every man still in a cell like mine." Life outside prison was both beautiful and confusing. He marveled at simple things: automatic doors, smartphones, busy streets. Sometimes the noise of crowds startled him. He would flinch at sudden movement, a reflex carved by decades of confinement. Nights were the hardest. Sleep did not come easily. The silence of solitary had followed him. He once said he would wake up expecting to see gray walls, only to find sunlight spilling through the window. But Albert refused to let trauma define his final years. Instead, he turned it into purpose. Alongside civil rights activists and former inmates, he began to campaign for prison reform and the abolition of long-term solitary confinement. His story was no longer just about him, it was about every voice lost in America's prison system. He traveled the country, speaking at universities, public events, and human rights summits. Each time, the audience sat in silence, moved by the quiet strength of a man who had every reason to be bitter but chose compassion instead. In 2019, Albert published his memoir, Solitary. The book was raw, haunting, and deeply human, an inside look into a world few survive. Critics called it one of the most powerful prison memoirs ever written. It revealed not only the physical torture of isolation but the psychological warfare that comes with being unseen. In his words, "They could control my body but not my mind. That was my freedom." The book became a rallying point for activists and reformers. Politicians cited his case when arguing against solitary confinement. Amnesty International used his story as evidence of systemic cruelty within U.S. prisons. Even the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture referenced Albert's name when calling prolonged isolation a form of psychological torture. But Albert's greatest impact was not in the headlines, it was in the quiet moments he shared with others. He visited former inmates struggling to adjust to freedom. He spoke to young people about discipline, dignity, and resilience. "I am not a victim," he said. "I am a survivor." His calm voice carried the weight of experience that textbooks could never teach. Despite the peace he projected, Albert's health began to decline. Years of confinement had taken their toll, heart problems, breathing difficulties, and constant fatigue. Yet he never slowed down. Even when hospitalized, he continued to write letters, mentor others, and advocate for reform. To the end, he remained the same man who had survived 4 decades of silence, focused, unbroken, and unafraid. On August 4, 2022, Albert Woodfox passed away at the age of 75. The news spread quickly from New Orleans to London to Geneva. Tributes poured in from former prisoners, journalists, lawyers, and human rights groups. The man who had entered Angola as a number left the world as a symbol of endurance. His passing was mourned not as a tragedy but as a victory, proof that the human spirit could survive even the darkest places. In his final interviews, Albert often reflected on what freedom truly meant. "It's not just walking outside a cell," he said. "Freedom is how you choose to live, even when everything's been taken from you." Today his legacy continues. His name is taught in classrooms, cited in reform bills, and spoken in protests demanding change. The Angola Three are remembered not just as prisoners but as men who exposed a truth America could no longer ignore, that justice without humanity is just another kind of cage. Albert's story reminds us that even in the smallest, darkest room, a spark of hope can survive. And when that spark endures long enough, it becomes a light, one bright enough to shine through steel, through concrete, through time itself.